Welcome back, Rock Hoppers. I'm Stately. I'm the lead developer of the game, and today I'm going to be talking about the prefab settings menu and how to test your prefab in-game. If you haven't already watched the first two tutorial videos, you should check those out first. This video will be the last introductory video. After this, we're going to move on to more complex subjects. So, alright, here we are again with our little prefab. Let's go ahead and pull up the prefab settings menu. We're going to be spending a little bit of time in the menus today. I apologize, but it can't be avoided. So, prefab settings, and here we go. The internal name here, we've talked about this very briefly before. This is never shown to the player. This is the name that is used for sorting prefabs in the prefab menu and for searching for prefabs. Next to it, we have the friendly name, and this is the name of the prefab that is displayed to the player. We're going to call this something. Let's call it Abandoned Listening Post. It's not necessarily an abandoned listening post, but it can be whatever we want because, hey, it's our prefab, right? So this name will be displayed to the player the first time they discover it, and it'll be shown as a location discovered notification, and you'll receive a small XP bonus. After that, oh, that's not how you spell listening, is it? After that, you still get the notification when you enter the prefab, but it does not give you a bonus every time you enter it. Another thing to bear in mind is the game, the world generator, will add a modifier to this. So it's called Abandoned Listening Post now. Once it's in the game and it's been generated, it'll be called something like Abandoned Listening Post Delta 25. All right, next up we have our maximum and minimum instances here. This is pretty straightforward. This is how many of this prefab are allowed to appear in the world. It's a good practice to set a maximum. If you leave it at 0, the world generator will basically place as many prefabs as it reasonably can, and what the world generator considers reasonable is not reasonable. So, always set a maximum. If you don't set a minimum, your prefab might not show up. It probably still will if your commonality is good enough. The only thing to consider is if you have a very complex prefab and you do not set a minimum number, the world generator might run out of valid places to put it before it even tries to place it. And the reason for that is that the world generator will always try to place the minimum number of prefabs of every type before it starts placing prefabs that don't have a minimum. So we're going to keep this simple here. We're going to start with a minimum of 1 instances and a maximum of 2. Okay, moving on to the next one, our commonality indicator. This is pretty much what it says on the box. The commonality is how frequently the world generator will try to place this prefab, and think of it as marbles in a bowl. If you have a prefab with a commonality of 1 and you have a prefab with a commonality of 10, you'll put 11 marbles in the bowl. 1 of those marbles will be for the first prefab, 10 of them will be for the second prefab. It will almost always try to place the second one first, but if the second one doesn't fit, it'll go back and try the first one. Generally, your commonality should be between 1 and 10. And we'll put this at 5 because that's a nice middle between 1 and 10. All right, moving on. Placement rules. Things get a little more interesting here. Our placement rules are where in the world we want this prefab placed. Our options are a surface prefab, a void prefab, and a subsurface prefab. Now, it's pretty straightforward, I suppose. Void prefabs, they appear in space. Subsurface prefabs appear under the ground, and surface prefabs appear on the surface. The only thing you need to consider with this is that this works in conjunction with the biomes. You can set a surface prefab, but if you don't select a biome, there will be no surfaces. The same is true of subsurface settings. If your placement is subsurface, you have to set a biome. The only exception is void prefabs. And void prefabs, by definition, don't spawn on a biome. They won't spawn on or inside of an asteroid. But if you have a void prefab and you set a biome, it will spawn near an asteroid of that type. And if you don't, if you have a void prefab and you don't set a biome, it will still try to spawn in the world, but it will spawn away from any asteroid. So it will spawn way out in the void of space. And that can be desirable. You know, it's entirely possible that you want your base to be out in the void. You can set multiple biomes for a single prefab. For example, if I wanted this prefab to show up in the tutorial biome and the stone biome, I could just select both of them, and that would work just fine. Moving on, the exclusion range. The exclusion range dictates how far away other prefabs must be from this prefab. Now, prefabs will not overlap each other. If you set this to 0, they can spawn right next to each other, but one prefab should never impinge on another prefab. It can be desirable, though, to have your prefabs some distance away from each other so it doesn't look cluttered, and visually it's more appealing. And for gameplay purposes, you don't want everything stacked on top of each other. For a small build like this, something like 10 meters or 20 meters should be fine. Big builds could go all the way up to 50, but again, you can leave it to 0, and that's not the end of the world. Now you'll notice we have some substructure options here. We have this substruct checkbox, and we have these cluster options. I'm not going to talk about those today because our next tutorial episode will talk about our modular prefabs, and that's where these come into play. And finally, we have our use in world gen check here. It's the big checkbox at the bottom, and that again does exactly what it says on the box. If you don't check use in world gen, your prefab will not be used when you try to create a world. Pretty straightforward. Okay, now that we've done this and we've set this up to our satisfaction, we have a name for it, we have an instance count and a commonality, and we've told the game where we want it. It doesn't matter, but I'm just going to set this for the tutorial biome. We'll go ahead and apply this, and we'll save the game. Now, this will show up in testing. If we build a world right now, it will use this prefab in the world, but we're not quite ready yet. We want to streamline our testing a little bit. And what I mean by that is we don't want to have to go looking around the entire game world to find our prefab. So what we're going to do here is we're going to make sure that we have a world spawn. And we do have a world spawn. So that's great. We'll save our game. And if you remember, we talked about the world spawn in the previous episode, and I explained how there can only be one world spawn, otherwise you might get inconsistent spawn results. Well, we want the world spawn to be on our prefab because we're testing our prefab. We don't want to have to go look for it. So what we're going to do right now is we will disable all of our other world spawns. And as you can see, I have a few here, and all of them are active except for this one. Oh, I forgot to mention, you can turn prefabs on and off without loading them by clicking the active button here. So there we go. Now we have one world spawn, and it's our test prefab here. So we're ready to go ahead and create a world. We do that by clicking New World, and we can call this whatever we want. We're going to call it Test World. The seed can be whatever you want. All you need to bear in mind is if you use the same seed with the same prefabs, you will get the same world. And because we're testing and we want to keep this simple, we're going to turn the rock count all the way down, and we're going to turn the size all the way down. One thing to bear in mind here, if I turn my rock count down, I only have one biome. And the biomes are created in the order which they're listed. So the one biome I'm going to get is the tutorial biome. If my prefab is not meant to be in the tutorial biome, it won't spawn. So what I want to do in that case, just to keep things moving along, is I'll change the biome temporarily for the purpose of testing. I'll change it to the tutorial biome. And then once I've tested it and I'm satisfied with the way it looks, I'll change it to the actual biome I want to be in. If you're willing to wait around for world generation to complete, you don't have to do that. It'll work just fine. You can create 6 asteroids, and you'll be guaranteed one of each biome, and that'll work just fine too. The description is not shown to the players. The description is for the purpose of loading and managing worlds. So we don't have to put anything here. And we're going to go ahead and launch the world. And then, having launched the world, we wait. And we wait. And we wait. But eventually, the world generates. And here we are at our prefab with our friend the Sproach. And that is pretty much all there is to it. We've gone over the basics here. Oh, hello, there's a Voidox here come to say hi. So over these last couple of episodes, we've gone over all of the basics. Today we've covered how to configure our prefab settings. We've covered how to create a test world so you can look at your prefab in the real world and see how everything's going to turn out. And that's kind of the foundation of how to make prefabs for rock hoppers. There's so much more to tell you, though. I can't even begin to tell you how much more cool stuff we have lined up. But that's going to be for our advanced course, which is just going to be the next lesson. So what we're going to do after this is we're going to talk about modular prefabs, and that's where the prefabs get really exciting. And we'll talk about how to use mission markers and mission targets on the prefabs. And then finally, we're going to look at the story arc system and talk about how to pull all of this stuff together and how to make it all work in the story. So thank you again for tuning in. This has been a short one. I guarantee you the next one won't be. And I'll see y'all then.